Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars The Clone Wars video. This one is going to be my Season 7 in review discussion. So Season 7 is over, The Clone Wars is now over. Let's look back on Season 7. How was it overall? Because I think the important thing to realize in this discussion is that Season 7 wasn't just the Siege of Mandalore. Those last 4 episodes weren't all of Season 7. Season 7 was 3 arcs. And not all of those arcs were the same. And there was a big gulf in quality between, in a way, all of them to a degree. So, in this video, I'm going to be focusing more on the critiques I have about the season. But know overall that I did enjoy all of these episodes to a certain degree. Obviously some more than others and so on. But I reviewed each individual episode over the last, 12 or so weeks. And I did enjoy it all thoroughly. But here, in reflection, we have to get into the kind of discussion about where was it good, where was it bad, where could things have been improved, and where did they get it wrong. And so, yes, it means that I will be focusing a little bit more than I usually do on the criticisms, but know that in counterpoint to most of these criticisms, there's always like a positive counterpoint of, yes, the Siege of Mandalore was excellent. Ahsoka it was great to see her in action. It was great to see Maul back, and how they overall wrapped up the show with the final arc was very, very strong. But we have to talk about this. So let's get straight into the, I suppose, problem that I have with this season. And that is that the overall season didn't feel like a particularly amazing ending to the Clone Wars because of the arc makeup that they chose to go with. They went for the Siege of Mandalore because they had to go for the Siege of Mandalore. If they were announcing this as the end of the Clone Wars, that was the arc they had to do regardless of where in production that they were on it. And to me, they had to do a full season here. They weren't just going to do the final arc, so they had to do a season, a small season. So what did they do with the other 8 episodes? And to me, the only thing I can come to the conclusion on in terms of how they made the decisions to go with the arcs that they went for is that they went for the arcs that were the closest to being done. And those were clearly the Ahsoka arc and Bad Batch. Or they made the decision of, it probably maybe would have been Bad Batch and the Crystal Crisis on Utapau arc, but they realized they had to have some Ahsoka thing. So I think we also know that the Ahsoka arc in its early stages was also fairly close to being done animatic-wise. So either way, they were dealing, I think, with a decision between 3 arcs that were very, very close to completion, and they chose the other 2 arcs in the season based entirely off that, rather than making sure all 3 arcs hit the same level as the finale arc, Siege of Mandalore. And so we end up with this weird situation where they decided to start off our final season with an arc a lot of hardcore Clone Wars fans had already seen already in the animatics. The Bad Batch arc we had seen already, and in that sense, it was a pretty poor choice to start the season off with something we'd already seen so heavily. And especially with the way the sort of continuity went, I don't even think you needed to do it that way. It almost would have been better, I think, switching it around and having the Ahsoka arc come first and building into the hype of Ahsoka, then maybe having that clone arc to lead into Siege of Mandalore, which is Order 66 focused. That way you're dealing with the clones in a good light just prior to their turn, rather than having like an Ahsoka arc in between. They maybe could have done that as well. But either way, the problem with Bad Batch is just that it was a sort of relatively unexciting arc. For a lot of people, they'd already seen it, so it was a month of waiting for Ahsoka. It was a month of waiting for properly new content. And while the Bad Batch arc is good, they made a couple of scene changes that kind of worked for the most part. 1 or 2 of the exclusions was kind of weird, but the new scene of Anakin and Padme was excellent, as well as the sort of scenes that went along with that of Rex, standing guard outside, the fact that Obi-Wan makes a comment that he clearly knows about Anakin and Padme and so on. That was pretty fun. But overall, what did the Bad Batch arc really accomplish for the final season? And in my mind, not much, because by the end of that arc, Echo goes off with the Bad Batch, and we don't see the Bad Batch for the rest of the season. And as far as we know, we don't know at all where we see them again. We don't know at all where we see Echo again. So it felt like an unnecessary amount of episodes. 4 episodes for this arc just to get to this point of we get Echo back, but he goes off again. Felt a little just like, oh wow, we accomplished something to just go away from it. Okay. Rex had an arc here, of course, his devotion to getting Echo back and putting himself on the line for one of his troopers that he kind of, got into his squad and so on. That was good. But again, I don't think that really came through particularly clearly, that there was meant to be a link between that little Rex arc in the middle of Bad Batch and then where he is in Siege of Mandalore. Because during Order 66, you didn't really focus on Rex that much in the sense of, like, him specifically thinking about individual clones. Of, like, if I'm fighting back against my brothers, I'm fighting back against Fives, against Echo, against Jesse, all these characters. That you didn't quite hit that home hard, which makes it feel like Bad Batch is more of this solo arc that is only here because they decided it was a relatively easy arc to put together. There, of course, was some fantastic action in it. The Bad Batch were nice, kind of different types of clones, but, they didn't have the depth of character to justify, I think, 4 episodes. And beyond that, there was, like, okay, a little bit of a dark Anakin moment with him taking out Trench, but it wasn't too dark because he was just defending himself. But either way, the death of Trench was kind of a nice kind of conclusion to have. But, yeah, not the most memorable arc. Good, middle of the road among all Clone Wars episodes and arcs, but clearly there's a lot of other arcs in the show that are much, much better than Bad Batch. It's better than some, but it's pretty middle of the road, not quite what you wanted to start off the season with. And I think that's pretty fair to say. I definitely got the impression that the hype for the Clone Wars was right up here when the season was about to premiere. And then over the course of the Bad Batch, it just kind of goes down, 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 down. Of, like, of course, everyone waiting for Ahsoka. We've already seen this before, and so on. They definitely brought expectations down with that arc. So then we move into the middle arc. The Ahsoka arc, the Rafa and Trace arc, Martez sisters, whatever way you want to call it. How was this? Surely this was where we really kick things off. 8 episodes to the end of the season, Ahsoka focused. We'll get into her character arc and explore her individually in the Ahsoka arc, and then we'll get into the big bombastic stuff of Order 66, Siege of Mandalore, Darth Maul in the last arc. Not quite, because they didn't really accomplish anything with Ahsoka in the Ahsoka arc, which is probably the most baffling thing that happened this season. That the one arc that they decided to do for Ahsoka to transition the character between her Season 5 leaving of the Jedi Order and then her return in Siege of Mandalore was this. And in many ways, this was the big disappointment of this season. This was another thing of Ahsoka's back, expectations are high, but then as the 4 episodes went on, people were just like, what are we doing with this arc? Because it wasn't really about Ahsoka. Ahsoka is in this arc, and I suppose her arriving to meet the Martez sisters allows this arc to sort of play out. But she's just along for the ride with the sisters and what they're doing. And it's just, her on her own, just having to help them. And that's basically the arc that they went for here, is that Ahsoka can't stay out of the action. It is in her very nature to help people. That's about the conclusion that they came to at the end of this arc. There were a couple of moments where they teased some things of like, oh, she mentions like Skywalker Academy, she was thought to fight by her brother, referencing Anakin. There were nice little tiny moments of the arc. There were moments where you got the sense of like, oh, like maybe she is thinking about what's going on and she's still doubtful about things. But none of it was expressed. It was all in her head and none of that came out. It was always forever just the sisters maybe saying something that was kind of related to what Ahsoka's going through. But pretty much just at the very end of the arc, I think it was Rafa said something to Ahsoka like that, yeah, it is in your nature to help people. That's what you're good at. And basically in a way saying that, yeah, it's probably about time you go back to the Order in some way and are able to actually help people. But yeah, like that's the thing. The arc was the sisters. It was entirely, the plot was based around them doing their thing, and Ahsoka was just along with them to get them out of their situation. And I think that was the frustration that a lot of people had with this arc, was that in many ways, like, the sisters weren't the best characters. They were okay, but Trace ended up being presented as a little bit too idiotic for, I think, a lot of people. And then Rafa was also sort of like too far down the, like, are you really that dumb that you can't see that what you're doing is just you're getting way too in deep in terms of into the criminal underworld here. And Ahsoka was the only voice of reason among the three of them that was there the entire time. And the biggest, I think, criticism I have against this arc is that when you get to the end, they don't even resolve the sisters as characters. There's no proper ending for them. We just go back to the start. The sisters go back to their usual way of doing things. Ahsoka leaves, and there's no sense that, like, the sisters have grown really from meeting Ahsoka beyond that, like, okay, Rafa probably won't get involved in anything too crazy, criminal underworld. That was about it. And I don't think that that was good enough. Like, there was no sense that she left the sisters with anything specifically that's going to help them going forward. They maybe slightly got past their hatred of the Jedi upon seeing Ahsoka, that their experience with, like, what happened with Luminara and being so upset about that was very much based in just their tragedy and not necessarily their actual views in the Jedi. But they don't think they explored that well enough. And that was the big thing of, like, you had 4 episodes with these sisters, and then it's basically, oh, Bo-Katan's here by characters we've known for 4 episodes. And it's just crazy that, like, Bo-Katan at this point isn't even the most well-known character in Star Wars, but she just arrives in right at the end and immediately eclipses these 2 characters we've known for, like, 3 and a bit episodes, like that. That Ahsoka is just gone and these characters do not matter. And that's the problem with this arc, is that in the end, did it matter? Do you need to have watched the Ahsoka, Rafa, and Trace arc to have context for basically anything that happens in Siege of Mandalore? And the answer ultimately is, like, not really. You could watch the last, like, 2-3 minutes of the last episode of the Ahsoka arc and you're good to go on what happened. You do not need to know the full 4 episodes of this arc to get where Ahsoka is in Siege of Mandalore. Because nothing that happened in, like, the previous 4 episodes really mattered in terms of Ahsoka's view on things. I'll get into a little bit more depth on the whole what happened to Rafa and Trace's parents. They basically established that, like, what's a green-skinned Jedi, it's probably Luminara. The line of dialogue that they quote her as saying to them feels like a Luminara line. That Luminara was involved in this chase sequence. She's on top of the ship trying to hunt down Zero. She has to crash the ship. It's going to crash. Does she crash it onto a landing platform and potentially kill a whole crowd of people, or into the wall and risk the people behind that wall? She decides to crash it into the wall, and Rafa and Trace's parents are killed. She comes to them later and basically says, you know, like it was the will of the Force or something like that. May the Force be with you, or something like that. Not the most, you know, sympathetic or anything like that, but, you know, that's Luminara for you. And it's a tragic thing. Like, for Ahsoka, she reacts. It's this kind of tragic thing. But I think Ahsoka shows a level of understanding for what happened, because she's been in those type of sequences before, where it is a case of, like, when you're crashing a ship, like, you have to land it somewhere, and someone's going to be at risk. That's just the case of it. And I think Ahsoka was in general fairly understanding of the situation of, like, she gets their frustration with the Jedi and what's happening, but is understanding of their position. So by the end of it, it's just, like, just them discovering that she is a Jedi and is helping them, helps them to realize that their experience is not an example of what the Jedi are typically like, and their hatred of Jedi is more just grounded in the tragedy of the loss of their parents, more than actual hatred of the Jedi. Which is where I feel that this arc did a very bad job at just presenting what ended up being kind of an important part of the first 2 episodes of the Mandalore arc, the Siege of Mandalore arc, was Ahsoka's view on things. That again, this is meant to be the arc where we explore Ahsoka on her own away from the Order, when she's figuring things out. That's what she says to Anakin as she leaves in Season 5. They have their big talk, and he's like, "You're making a mistake, Ahsoka. This is where you're meant to be. This is your home. How can you leave? You know, how can you do this to me?" almost. And she leaves and basically says that, "No, this is my decision. I have to make it myself. I have to figure things out on my own." What does she figure out? We don't get any of her actual views on the council. We get none of her views on the Jedi, none of her views on how she feels being away from the Order, really, in this arc. And that is the problem. That this whole season, in a way, isn't really much of a character exploration of Ahsoka. And I think that's the problem of that, because they don't cover any of what she's feeling in between. When she actually comes into contact with Obi-Wan and the Council, and she's kind of going at them for things, it's like, whoa, 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 like, what's informing some of this? And I think that's where the problems come in, and they could have set us up better for this, in this arc, or, like, made her opinion that little bit clearer. And that's where I'd just be somewhat critical of, like, the not really doing any character development for Ahsoka for the most part here. But anyway, let's get into Siege of Mandalore here. Obviously, it's fantastic. It is probably the best overall Clone Wars arc in terms of how well it is done. I maintain that I don't think it was the most satisfying ending we could have got, because it definitely feels like there's still so much left on the table, that they could have done more of an epilogue. And I think it comes down to, like I'll get into here, the season's still not feeling like there's much of a Ahsoka character arc. It felt a little flat to me, just ending it on that note of Ahsoka looking at the graves of the clones and their helmets, and then just dropping the lightsaber there, and that's the last shot of Ahsoka in the Clone Wars. It just felt like, oh, like, I get you're going for the kind of symbolism or whatever of her being silent, and you're going for the tone there with it being silent and emotional, letting the music play, but you probably needed to have Ahsoka say something to Rex about how she feels about this. That we just end Ahsoka post Order 66, everything lost, knowing that something's gone wrong, Anakin may be dead and all this sort of stuff, and you just end it like that. It felt like it felt like, honestly, they were like, oh, well, you know what this means. Like, if you read the Ahsoka novel, you know her dropping the lightsaber means she's, like, quote-unquote faking her death, leaving behind this important weapon that means so much to her, it being given back to her by her master, and now she's leaving it behind. That clearly has to signify that anyone who finds it must think that she's dead. And it's like, okay, fine, but it didn't quite hit home as much as I think it needed to, and that to me is most of this arc in that sense. I think they hit the emotional beats of, like, the setup for Order 66, the duel with Maul, all that stuff in terms of, like, action is done, like, very, very well. That's why this arc is ultimately so fantastic, is they nailed this Siege of Mandalore action stuff. Finally seeing Ahsoka be like an even match to a degree for Maul, that she has grown from being that, you know, Padawan, you know, what is it, Snips, calling Anakin Sky Guy, to now being able to face Maul and have a chance at defeating him. That's a huge, you know, show of growth for the character in terms of, like, across the seasons. The problem, though, is that I don't think they showed any character growth from just the more recent time period of the transition from Season 5 into Season 7. Which is what I'm going to get into here. A lot of the earlier scenes with Ahsoka, of, like, she comes back, she finally gets to meet Anakin and Obi-Wan, and she's very closed off with Anakin. She's not really willing to get into any of the discussion with him. And so they have to more talk just about the clones, her return, And then with Obi-Wan, she's very aggressive towards him over what's going on here. And this is where I really don't feel the characters like we're like informed enough about her view on things, because she goes at Obi-Wan quite aggressively in that, you know, couple of scenes that they have in that first episode over why won't you give us clones to support the siege of Mandalore? Like, you have a connection here, shouldn't you care? And Obi-Wan is very pragmatic in this whole thing of like, you have to know the full scope of what's going on in the war. Like, the Jedi are scattered across the galaxy, like in the Outer Rim sieges and so on. We've just ended the battle here. We have to, you know, get ready for our next battle, which is when the attack on Coruscant comes in. And this is where I think Ahsoka, I think they got to this scene kind of wrong slightly, because it makes Ahsoka seem so sort of selfish in a way of like, okay, Anakin, we have to go rescue the Chancellor. The Coruscant is under attack. We have to go back to this one. It makes sense because, like I said, every other Jedi is pretty much covered out on some sort of another battlefield. They're freed up. They're the ones who can go straight away to the siege of Coruscant. And Ahsoka's just like, no, you have to come to the siege of Mandalore because I care about the siege of Mandalore and we have to have another battle here. And it's just that sense of like, Mandalore is this neutral system. It's not part of the Republic. And while Obi-Wan does care, the war is this thing that is going on. That, like, none of them know the full scope of what's going on in the war at this point in time. So I don't get why there's absolutely zero understanding from Ahsoka about why Obi-Wan and Anakin would be required to go after the Chancellor. Especially when, like, in a later scene, she directly says that, like, you know, the Chancellor is a mentor to Anakin. She kind of, like, defends him when the Council say they're, like, investigating the Chancellor. And it's kind of like, whoa, Ahsoka, what is your opinion here? This is getting a bit, like, weird. Like, you're criticizing the Jedi for both following basically orders of the Republic to go after the Chancellor, but then you're criticizing the Jedi for doing their own thing in terms of investigating the Chancellor. And it's kind of like, is it just meant to be that she's just in general frustrated with the Council and is just showing her displeasure with them, and she's not actually meant to be making a specific point or anything like that? Because I've seen people, like, heavily praise Ahsoka for this scene, for like, yeah, Ahsoka, you know, go at the Council like this, but I didn't really view a lot of those scenes that way, in terms of, I did view it as it more being like, yeah, Ahsoka's a little bit letting herself be controlled by her emotions here, whereas Obi-Wan isn't. In that, if there was the option, I think Obi-Wan would have, you know, chosen to, you know, go to Mandalore himself, but the war is going on. Like, what would happen if they didn't go there and they just let the Chancellor be captured? That the center of the Republic is being attacked, and you're saying that we shouldn't prioritize that? And Ahsoka should know this, because she showed some understanding of, like, the Jedi's position of being in the war in the Ahsoka arc in the middle of the season. And here she just shows, like, she, like, turns off, like, her tactical brain here almost, of just like, yeah, just let the Separatists attack there, you come here instead. And ultimately they resolve it. Like, Anakin gives her, like, half of the 501st, Rex gets to go with her, and they figure it out. But it remains that thing of, like, you know, you can't be a commander in the Grand Army of the Republic unless you're part of the Grand Army of the Republic. You're not a Jedi. Like, that's a thing. Your decision previously has meant that you can't be as in the position that you want. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And I think part of what happens here is meant to be Ahsoka accepting the consequences of her decision. Now, I don't think they explore sort of either side of this as well as they should, in the sense of the Council feeling like discussing their mistake too heavily, or Ahsoka discussing her own decision to leave too heavily. Because ultimately, as it is left, Ahsoka just leaves because she's upset. And because we never really explore her true feelings on the topic, it's just left there as being, she feels betrayed, and there's a level of understanding to that. But she's clearly not meant to just be out on her own somewhere in Coruscant, doing stuff like she did with Rafa and Trace. She's destined for more. So they were always teasing her coming back into the Order. But then when she comes back in, she's heavily criticizing them for this, and that. And it's not explored as well as it should be. And it just feels weird that, like, she's going so heavily at Obi-Wan, or, like, there's this frustration with Mace Windu being fairly logical about the thing of, like, you're not part of the Grand Army Republic, so of course we're not going to tell you our inner details of, like, what specifically the council in a council discussion is planning to do. We can't inform you of that. And that's the whole point here, is like, I can't be overly critical of, like, Mace Windu in that sequence. Like, of course, he's not meant to be the nicest Jedi. He's sort of meant to represent that one that of any of them you're meant to sort of dislike, hate to a degree, because of, like, he represents in a way the worst of the Jedi. But again, what are the Jedi meant to do? And I think there's a little bit too much of that in Star Wars just in general right now. Episode 8 did this. I definitely got the sense that there was an element of, in the writing of it here, of just, let's criticize the Jedi without actually logically thinking it through. Of, like, let's criticize the Jedi for allowing this mastermind plan to happen. And it's just like, just give credit to the mastermind plan. Like, how are the Jedi so heavily at fault for not seeing this crazy sequence of events that leads to two fake armies fighting each other just to get the Jedi into a specific position where one army can turn on the Jedi and kill them all instantly, and, you know, Palpatine can then take control as of the Republic as the Empire. Like, and like, people are arguing that, like, how did he not figure that out? And it's like, we only know that because we as the audience see all sides of this and are aware that this is the plan and how it's forming. The Jedi are unaware of this because they felt the Sith have been gone for so long, when in fact this plan has been that long in the making. It's not just Palpatine's plan, it's all of the Rule of Two Sith back to Bane is basically where this plan comes from to a degree. So that's why, like, I can't ever be, like, too heavily critical of the Jedi, and it's why I don't like what, like, Luke says about the Jedi in episode 8. It feels way too negative towards them, and that it's giving Sidious no credit at all. In that, look, the Jedi were outsmarted here by Sidious, and I don't think that's too much of a problem because it was a masterful plan of what he was able to do. It's meant to be a tragedy that the Jedi are taken out here, and that they kind of latched onto, like, oh, we're onto the right path of figuring things out, like, right towards the end, in terms of, as the Clone Wars is coming to the end, they discover stuff like, wait, it wasn't Sifo Dyas, it was, like, Dooku, like, under the guise of Sifo Dyas, who actually ordered the clone army. So, like, what's going on? And, like, they're still fighting in this war, which is the thing of, like, as much as they now know that sort of the two armies are being played against each other, it's like, if we don't fight, we're just letting ourselves get taken over. So we have to fight. But if we fight, we're playing into it. So what do? They're locked into this situation now, in that the only option would be to just, like, back away from the war. But if they do that, they're leaving the clones to just be kind of massacred by the droids, because the droids have the numbers advantage. And it's the Jedi that keep the clone army basically in most of the battles. And that's the frustration here, is just that I don't think they discuss a lot of the topics that they're touching on in as nuanced of a way as they kind of need to. And it makes a lot of the scenes feel sort of undercooked, that, like, you haven't thought that through. The writing hasn't thought that one through. You're missing this situation or whatever. They're relatively small scenes. Like, I'm talking about, like, 4 or 5 scenes from overall 4 incredible episodes, but it speaks to the fact that the few times they went for kind of big Ahsoka character moments in this arc, I felt like I was left feeling like, what's informing your thought process there, Ahsoka? And I think that's where you get into, like, some of the better stuff of, like, when they actually did get into addressing, like, how Ahsoka feels about things. I think they got to a good point of showing, like, her making these mistakes, these things that she'll be regretting for her years, all the way up into Rebels and onwards, of, like, what if I was there? What if I did come back? What if I was able to be there next to Anakin by his side when all of this stuff was happening? would things have turned out differently? And I think they do a good enough job to get across the idea that the answer is yes. If Ahsoka was able to have a scene, a conversation with Anakin during a key moment during Revenge of the Sith, I think this could have been averted. Now, admittedly, I think Palpatine might have switched his plan around a little bit and done something to take Ahsoka out, like manipulating the Council into sending Ahsoka off somewhere. But you have to assume Anakin and Ahsoka still would have had some sort of a conversation which would have changed up a little bit of the way that the dynamic actually went. And that's the regret that she has. She constantly is like, oh, I'll talk to Anakin again. And there's the regret over why was she so closed off in the earlier sequences with him? Why didn't she kind of have a more open emotional talk with him earlier on? Why was it just about the clones and the lightsabers and so on? That's a regret. It was a regret that she just missed him as she walks in on the council meeting. It's a regret that she doesn't really send a message through Yoda to him. It's a regret that she doesn't tell them what Maul told her about Anakin and him being like groomed to be the next kind of Sith Lord by Darth Sidious. That's probably the big one in a way that I was kind of surprised, but also like happy that they were willing to kind of let Ahsoka make a mistake like that. That she lets her distrust of the Council, her issues with them, kind of get in the way and not reveal to them an important piece of information. And it being very much this almost like petty thing between her and Mace Windu of like, Mace didn't tell me what they were doing with regards to Palpatine, so I'm not going to tell them this, and kind of look what happened. Kind of in a way on both sides, but I think the Ahsoka side of that is the more kind of critical one because she cares about Anakin, and ultimately the other Jedi do care about Anakin. Why didn't she tell them? And that's a huge regret as we get to this point. And that's what they link into in Rebels, which is that I think Vader kind of like says to her, you know, like, why did you leave me? And her even saying that, like, getting, I suppose, to that point of like, you know, I should have been there at the end and so on. And I think that's really good to have that for the character, have those regrets of like decisions that she did or didn't make. She should have made a slightly different choice, and addressing it to a degree of like what would have happened if she just stayed there. She accepted the Council's like apology. She became a full-on knight and was just there for the end of the Clone Wars. What would have happened? That's where I feel they actually get to some good stuff. It's just, to me, a lack of depth into what I feel was meant to be, in a way, the really interesting dynamic with Ahsoka during this season, that being her thought process being away from the Order, and they just didn't do any of that, and it made a lot of the scenes where they finally did touch on it a little undercooked because you had no build up to them. You had no thinking about stuff on her own, figuring it out on her own, and instead it was like confrontations with the characters that she actually has issues with, and they didn't feel like they were as well developed, built up towards. But yeah, so overall Siege of Mandalore was an incredible arc. It managed to get the season back on track. After the Bad Batch brought people's expectations down, and then the Ahsoka arc really brought people's expectations down, it managed to get us back up to this level. It managed to be the most hyped thing going into May the 4th. Barely anyone cared that, like, oh, Rise of Skywalker's on Disney+. It was all about that final episode of the Clone Wars, and that was great to see. That they nailed the Order 66 sequence, and the desperate escape, the desperate, you know, getting the chip out of Rex. The only things that I think is left sort of unsatisfying at the end is just that things that, like, in terms of this season should have been different. We should have had the Son of Dathomir arc to set up Maul's appearance back in the story, to have that transition from him being captured by Sidious to appearing in the Siege of Mandalore. That would have added so much to Maul's arc. As it is, it just feels like, here he is, let's use one line of dialogue to explain why he's here, and then he will just escape, and that's the last we'll see of him in the Clone Wars, and we just have to assume he goes on to do this and that, and so on. it would have been so much more meaningful if we'd had the setup for Maul. Because there's great stuff that happens in Son of Dathomir. Like, he meets Dooku for, like, the first time. He has this confrontation. Like, a lot of the villains have this massive confrontation between each other. And it leads to him escaping and getting to this point. It would have been fantastic to see that and really address that the Clone Wars has been where most of Maul's characterization has come from. But they didn't quite do that. That would have added something extra as well. It would have felt a little bit more meaningful seeing him escape again if we had seen his escape from Sidious. Especially to more inform like the vision that he had, because you get the impression it obviously happened during that Dathomir sequence and so on. Other stuff like from Rebels, we know that Gregor and Wolf are also clones who got their chips removed. Just the fact that they were utterly unexplored at all. We didn't see any of that whatsoever, and it's unclear about what exactly happened, because that line from that episode of Rebels now seems like a blatant contradiction, because Rex, what is said about Rex is kind of a lie based on what happened, so you have to assume that it's kind of the same for the others, and that it is more of a case of these clones have since had their chips deactivated. But again, how does Rex get into contact with Gregor or Wolf? How did those three come together? That's a story probably for a later time, maybe. I get the impression that Rex on his own away from Ahsoka probably does that. But we have to wait and see. Beyond that, you know, there's just a slight sense of like they sort of teased us a little bit with stuff like in the intro to one of the episodes, you see Grievous for a split second. They cut and you see like Kanan and Depa Billaba, I think is his master. You see, I think it's Plo Koon and Aayla Secura. And you felt that like, oh, when Order 66 happens, are they actually going to show us some of those moments from a slightly different context? Now that we know Plo Koon a lot more, how important the character is to Ahsoka. Wolf was obviously one of his commanders and stuff like that. Maybe Gregor was with Aayla Secura. Maybe that's what they were building towards. But no, it was just like a scene made for the intro of an episode to highlight where we are. There's a little kind of stuff that felt a little unsatisfying in that regard. But I think the main thing to say here is just that I'm shocked that this season wasn't just for, like, sorry, 3 incredible arcs. Why wasn't this season Son of Dathomir an actually like insightful character development of arc of Ahsoka on her own and the Siege of Mandalore? To me, that's what they should have done. I understand Dark Disciple probably was a little bit too much of a side story to maybe put in here, because I think it would have had to have been like 8 episodes or something, because it's a quite a long arc. It's like a 2-part. It's like 2 arcs together overall makes up that arc. But I think that's an opportunity of like, I think straight away there is a demand for more Clone Wars to fill in some of these gaps and then just to resolve other stories. Absolutely. And then with Ahsoka, of course, we know she's coming into The Mandalorian, and we know there's probably potential for the next animated series to focus on her and Sabine going after Ezra and whatever, maybe something happening with Thrawn or whatever. But again, they have to have a really good plot behind that, and not have it just be the adventures of Sabine and Ahsoka. So there's a few kind of questions that they have in terms of just filling in the gaps for Maul, filling in the gaps for Ahsoka, and delivering us something that's important and meaningful. And that's probably about where it is. It's just that like it was a great ending to the Clone Wars, but it felt like we ended ignoring some of these other plot threads, that there's still more out there that people absolutely want. I now really want the full animation for something like Crystal Crisis on Utapau, because I felt like 1 or 2 of the Obi-Wan Anakin scenes there where they talk about Ahsoka feel like so important to actually have in a completed episode at this point, and not just left in an animatic in this weird position canonically where it's an arc, it is technically complete, but because it's not been like officially released, like is it actually part of the continuity or not, and stuff like that. The fact that the Clone Wars now is this weird thing of like, oh, it's basically all covered in the animation, except it's a very important part of Maul's story, which is covered in this comic. Oh, and Ventress's entire end of her arc is covered in this book. Like, just fill in those last few gaps and I think you will have something great. Because people will come back if you deliver them the big arcs. And I really think like a big sort of movie-like event, like bringing it back for another Lost Missions style season to cover some of these things would be worthwhile, because I think you would get people invested, because people care about Ventress. I think you forget that like one of the first proper character and story-driven arcs in the Clone Wars was the Night Sisters arc, and people really got behind Ventress and her arc there. We want to see that come to an end. The end of Ventress arc, I'd love to see it done, because it's more of a romance arc. It is Quinlan Vos and her, and you're getting right into, again, the end of the Clone Wars with that one as well. That would be, I think, really good to see. But yeah, they're my thoughts on Season 7 of the Clone Wars. Like I said, I focus a little bit more on the criticisms here, just to get across that, like, it's not all just about the last arc was incredible, the last arc was incredible, and that makes the overall season incredible. We have to acknowledge that, like, it was very up and down this season. Like, all 3 arcs ultimately were good. One was incredible, the last arc was incredible, Bad Batch was like very, very solid, and the Ahsoka arc was watchable, very watchable, solid, but didn't in any way live up to what it should have. And that there were problems in this last season. It wasn't the best season of the Clone Wars, it's just the season of the Clone Wars that happens to have the best arc, the end arc. And that's a little bit disappointing. And that's where I'm going to end it. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on Season 7 as a whole for the Clone Wars, not just the finale arc, and what I had to say here. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.